Hi there, this video will be a demonstration of how to create a shape layer based animation in After Effects. So what I have so far is an example of what the ending point will look like within After Effects. So if I drag the timeline, you can see the ball will bounce. I'm going to come back here and let it play through, and then we're going to come back and create this from scratch. So I have a couple of different layers that are added here. I actually have several different compositions that are tied together, which is a good way to kind of structure your projects to make sure you have a good organization and can work on things individually, but then can combine larger parts of your project together. So this is the overall goal, to create some basic object motion and get used to animating in After Effects and get used to layers and how animation runs in this piece of software. So let's start from scratch. We're going to do create new project. And I'm going to go File, Save As. I'm just going to go create a new folder. We'll call this one, actually back up one. I already have one in here, but Object Animation, that's fine. And then I'm going to title the project, so we'll say Object Animation Project. There you go. All right. So in After Effects, we create a project, and then all of our assets and our compositions and everything we want to use within our visual display are saved in that project file. So first thing we save is the project file itself, and then here's the UI for After Effects. I have my project panel over here, which is all of my assets that I can then drive and drag into my compositions. The main composition windows in the middle, I don't have any, so I'm going to create some. I have a properties panel over here on the right, and then on the bottom is my timeline in my layers panel. So what we're going to do is start to create compositions that are going to allow us to be able to animate a simple object moving around using different layers. So we're going to create a composition, and I'm going to call this, let's just call this one ball, and let's go back to the resolution. I can just type in 1920 by 1080. Whoa. Let's unlock in that one now. We will do 1920 by 1080. Okay, 29.9 frames per second. That's good. And we're not going to need really a large composition, but let's just do 4 seconds. So how the duration works, the first set of zeros is hour, minute is the second, the third is seconds, and then milliseconds. So we're going to do 4 for the third column, which will create a 4-second duration. I can change my background color if I want to. I might just change this to a gray just to make it easier so it's not a black background. That'll be helpful in case we want to do shadows with the object motion later. So that'll be our settings for now. It'll be our ball setting. I'm actually going to right click in the project menu and choose new composition. You can also go to the composition drop down and do the same thing. Right click, new composition, and then we're going to call this one ball bounce. Leave the same settings, and then for a larger composition, I'm going to right click and do new composition again, and then we'll do main comp. Okay. We can always change some of these settings later, but so basically it's a hierarchy structure. I'm going to create the visual look of my ball in my ball composition. I'm going to animate the ball in the ball bounce composition, and then I'm going to use my main comp as my area to combine multiple compositions, sub-compositions together. It's a good way to kind of organize things, keep a hierarchy system. Alright, so in the ball composition, I'm going to double click on that. And if I've created all the compositions, my compositions will be coming up as tabs in my timeline down here. So I just want to make sure I have ball selected, and I want to make sure in the composition panel in the middle it says the ball composition is open up. Alright, so I'm going to come up here to the horizontal toolbar, left click on the rectangle tool or whatever tool it shows here, and I'm going to choose the ellipse tool. So this will create a circle for me, which I'm then going to call a ball. Right now the fill is white and the stroke is black with a pixel of 2, I think is what is default. I'm going to change the fill color to, let's just do a blue. That'll work for right now. Bright blue. Okay, and I'm going to have no stroke. I don't want to have a stroke on it. I want it to look like a ball instead of a 2D drawing. Alright, so then when I click and drag in the scene, I can create an ellipse. If I hold down shift while dragging, then it's going to create a perfect circle, which is what I want on a ball. So after I create that, then I can get my regular select tool. I can click and move it around the scene. I can also scale this up and down. If I hold down shift while scaling, that'll be uniform scale as well. Without holding shift, I can skew it. So if I hold down shift, I can do uniform scale. So the key thing to remember when using layers is I've created a new shape, and when I've done that, on this ball composition, it created a shape layer 1. And this ellipse was created in that shape layer 1. I can actually come in here and create other circles within this shape layer. And it's on the same layer, but it's a different ellipse. So basically I can still have a different ellipse selected and moved or animated, but it's still in the same layer. So I'm going to go in and select those two and delete those out. So that's a good starting point. The other thing to remember is that if I open up my shape layer, let's actually just right click on that and choose rename, and we'll call this one ball. And if I open up the arrow beside this layer, to the far left of that I have a visibility, which is a eye icon. I can turn on and off this layer as a whole. But underneath that there is possibly a contents and a transform, depending on what's in your layer. So in the layer there's the contents, and here is the ellipse, the circle I just dragged out and created. If I open that up, here are the parameters for that ellipse. And if I open up the transform ellipse, here are my transform parameters for the ellipse. If I move this around, the position transform is changing. I'll just undo that. Also on the layer itself, if I close the contents, the layer itself has its own set of transforms. So transforms are position, rotate, scale, and other main attributes that this object has. The layer has its own set of transforms, and then each individual shape that I created, this ellipse, has its own set of transforms. One thing I want to do is make sure I center my object and make sure the pivot point is centered before I do anything else. It's just a good starting point. And I want to do that on the transform ellipse, not the layer transform. So I can do this by clicking on the position transform, and I have two attributes. I have an X and a Y attribute, or horizontal and vertical. So if I click and drag on the first one, that's my X attribute, horizontal line. If I click and drag on the second one, that's my Y or vertical attribute. And if I also scale it out, I can scale it out this way and even do other things like rotate. I'm not seeing much of a visual change with rotate because it is a circle. There's also opacity I can drag down as well. Put 100 back to that. But what I want to do for position is right click on position and do edit values. And I want to do units, change this to % of composition. And I want to zero this to the composition just so that everything is centered and zeroed. So let's type in 0 for X and 0 for Y. And click OK. And that just pops it back in the center of the composition. No matter where I dragged and created it, and make sure it stayed or starts in the center. So that'll be a good starting point for us. Alright, so that's our transform. We also have a pivot point. The pivot point is that center circle that's not moving. It's in a little crosshair. And that's the way this object moves, rotates, and scales. So if I move the pivot point or anchor point over here and then go down to rotation, you see how the object rotates based off of this center little dot right there. So I'm going to change this later, undo back a little bit, put my pivot point back at 0, 0. But for a ball bounce, I want it to squash and stretch within the animation to add more interesting aspects to the motion. So what I'm going to do is actually take the anchor point and move it so it's at the bottom. This will allow me, so when I'm scaling, it'll scale from the bottom. It'll also rotate from that angle as well. So I just took the anchor point, kind of moved it up so it's at the bottom of the circle. Okay. That will move the position up some, which is fine, but we want to make sure we first zero the position of the ellipse to the center of the screen and then move the anchor point up. Alright, that'll work for now. Okay, so within this layer I also want to get my circle ellipse tools again and add a highlight on there so I can tell, you know, there's maybe some light on this object. Let's go to Fill, and I want to just add a lighter value. So maybe much lighter blue value. Whoops, actually I was editing that one. So let me actually make this one a little darker. There you go. And then I'm going to drag out another circle for the highlight. Do something like that. And then I'm going to change the fill this time. There you go. So it looks like I got a highlight on my ball now. Alright, that's it for the creation of the ball here. Alright, so that's the ball composition. In the ball bounce composition, I'm going to add the ball composition into the ball bounce. And I'm going to do that by clicking on the ball composition in the project tab and dragging it down here into the layer section of my timeline. So right over here. What it does is it adds it throughout the timeline from the very first frame to the end. Okay, so 4-second time. The ball's in the same exact position. This is okay, but the issue is it's the entire composition. I really want just the ball to be selected. If I try to move this around, I got the outer bounding box from the entire composition. That's okay, I just have to go back into the ball composition and we're going to make an adjustment here. So the first thing I'm going to do is click on this button right here which says Region of Interest, and then I'm going to drag select to focus the composition to just around the ball. I can use my scroll wheel to zoom in, I can hold down plus and left click and drag to pan around. And what I want to do with this Region of Interest is simply just move this in so that it's just selecting the area just outside of the ball. There you go. Move this up a little bit. That'll work. So this composition is not going to be the size at 1920 by 1080. It's just going to be the size of the ball. This is just on the ball composition. After I got my region of interest selected and refined, then I'm going to go up to Composition, Crop, Comp to Region of Interest. So that makes sure this composition is just the size of the ball. If I go back to the ball bounce composition and select that ball layer, which was my ball composition dragged into my layers panel, now the bounding box is just around the ball. It's not the size of my ball bounce composition. Alright, so now we're really ready to animate. Animation in After Effects is based off of keyframe based animation. So what I want to do is have the ball kind of start at the bottom of the composition. Zoom in, and I'm zooming in and out by using the scroll wheel. So scroll wheel zooms in and out. And with the arrow tool, I'm just taking my ball and moving it around. And all I really want to do is just move it down from the center of my composition. So if I want to move in an object, if I hold down Shift, that snaps to just one axis. Okay, so I just want to move this down so it's near the bottom of the composition. And my ball is actually a little bit large, so I'm actually just going to scale it down as well. I'm going to take the outer box, hold down Shift, and scale it down a little bit. That should be pretty good. I could have scaled in the ball composition, but let's just do it in the ball bounce. That's fine. Alright, in my ball bounce composition, I want to open up my ball layer and open up the transform. And I only have one transform set of parameters because this is adjusting the entire layer. If I need to go back and make individual adjustments to the look of this ball, I would do that in the ball composition. In the ball bounce composition is where I'm going to animate the ball. So I'm going to open up my transforms and I'm going to start animating. So I said this a minute ago, animation in After Effects is keyframe based animation. So basically I'm going to set and save the look and position of the ball on a certain frame, and then move the frame, change the attribute like the position of it, and set another keyframe. And After Effects will blend that motion for me. So if we go back to our composition settings, if I right click on this composition and go to composition settings, it is set up at 29.97 frames per second frame rate. So that's roughly 30 frames per second. And my duration is 4 seconds. So every 30 frames, that's 1 second. So here's 5 frames, 10, 15, 20, 25, and then instead of saying 30 frames, it says 1.00f, which means 1 second. So every 30 frames is 1 second. So there's 2, 3, and then the end of my timeline is 4. I'm just clicking and dragging up here in my timeline where the numbers are to see where my frame is. Okay, so what I want to do is build a ball bounce animation that starts at the bottom. It anticipates down, squashes down, jumps up in the air, stretches up as it's jumping up, and then hits the top of the arc and falls down due to what would be, as much as we can, natural gravity. Okay, so we're going to use the transform attributes of this ball layer to do that. We're not going to mess with everything, but actually we do need to adjust the anchor point here since we've pulled it in. But we will be adjusting the anchor point before we create animation, and then we're going to be animating with position, scale, and that'll be it for this one right now. So first thing we need to do is go back and adjust the anchor point again, and that will be the right axis. I'm just going to move the anchor point so it's at the bottom of my ball, and then I'm going to get my arrow tool and just move the ball down back close towards the ground. There we go. Alright, so now what we're going to do is animate the position first, and then we'll come back and adjust the scale and then go back and refine everything. So with the position attribute, there is like a stopwatch icon. It says time vary stopwatch. This is our toggle to turn on animation. So in order to start animating, we need to click on the stopwatch button beside position. So if I do that, it has a little diamond icon to the left of that, which means there is a keyframe somewhere on this timeline. If that is a blue diamond, that means there's a keyframe on this frame. So if I move my timeline and I look back on frame 0, there's a diamond shape on frame 0. That means it saved the position of this ball on frame 0. So first step, turn the stopwatch button on. That sets a first keyframe on whatever frame you have on. Now the better standpoint is to go to frame 0, the start of your timeline, or wherever you want this object's motion to start, and then click the stopwatch button. Because whenever you click the stopwatch button, it's going to create a keyframe on that frame. So that saves the motion of this ball on that frame. The next thing we want to do is change the frame. So we're just going to move down to maybe frame 30 frames in, or 1 second in. And I want to drag with the select tool the ball and make it move all the way up closer to the top of the scene composition. Now once I do that, since I already clicked on the stopwatch, if I make an adjustment on a different frame, it creates a second keyframe and thus creates animation. So now we see a dotted line showing me that there's motion in the scene. If I take my timeline and drag back towards the left, now I have movement. If I'm selecting the timeline and hit spacebar, that will play the animation. So over 1 second, I've now created animation where the ball starts at the bottom, animates towards the top. And I can hit spacebar to stop that again. I'm going to drag to 2 seconds in, and then we're going to reposition the ball back down to the bottom. Now we can try to be precise as much as possible, but it may not loop properly. It may not go to the exact same position. We guessed pretty well there. But it may be slightly off. So what we can do instead is just copy and paste a frame. So if I go to frame 2 seconds, or 60 frames in, make sure my timeline is on frame 2 seconds. And then if I go back to where my first keyframe is on frame 0, I'm going to drag select over that diamond keyframe and hit Control C. And since my timeline is on frame 2 seconds, if I hit Control V, it pastes that original keyframe that was on frame 0 on 2 seconds. So that way I know frame 0 is the same as 2 seconds. So now if I hit play, spacebar, it's going to be a simple motion of the ball starting on the bottom, moving up in the air, coming back down. So that's going to be our simple action of a ball bounce. It doesn't look great right now, but we can adjust the timing and it'll look a lot more natural. Alright, so to adjust the timing, we could create more keyframes, but the better process with keyframe animation is to use a graph to adjust the way the ball moves in and out of these keyframes. So the way this motion is created is plotting points on a 2D graph. And if I click on this button right here that says Graph Editor, so it's just above the Layers panel, it says Graph Editor. This is the graph of that animation. So if I hit spacebar to play, one attribute is changing, which is the position Y attribute. And the other attribute, which is a red line, is the x-axis. That axis is not changing. There's no horizontal motion of the ball. There's only vertical motion of the ball. And it's pretty straightforward. The motion has a constant velocity between these keyframes, and that's relevant or easy to see by the straight diagonal line between these three key points. So there's keyframe 1, and here's the top of the ball arc down the bottom, and then here is the third one on 2 seconds in, back where the ball's at the bottom. So all this is plotting the points on a grid over time, and that blends and creates that animation for us. So I only created 3 keyframes, and now I have a 2-second animation of a ball bounce. Alright, so what we can do is adjust the way the timing is set up, or what's called the ease in and ease out of the keyframes, the way the curves look as they move in and out of the keyframes, to adjust the look of the ball bounce so it looks more natural. Now, a natural ball bounce would have the ball have gravity take hold of it and pull it back down towards the ground surface. So what that means is it's going to be slowing down as it gets to the top of the arc, the top of the composition, and it's going to be faster as it gets closer to the ground. So because it's going to lose force as if it's bouncing up in the air, and it's going to have to get pulled back down to the ground through gravity. So to do that, I'm going to adjust the curve here of the y-axis. So I need to do a couple of things. Right now, the position graph shows me the x and the y-axis, the horizontal and the vertical axis. In order to fully adjust this, I need to separate the dimensions so I can adjust just the x or just the y-axis. So with position scale, let's click off of the grid so nothing's selected. So I just clicked in the dark area. And I want to select position, and in the layers panel, I'm going to right click on position and choose separate dimensions. Okay. There's also a button down here that says separate dimensions. If you have that attribute selected position, you can click separate dimensions. So this way, I can select just the y position or just the x position and see the animation that's created. Now really the only one that's really important is the y position because we just have vertical action right now. And we need to make some adjustments here. So to do this, we're going to select on a keyframe, and we have tangent lines. And these tangent lines can be changed, and it changes the way the animation blends that motion in and out of keyframes. So there's a couple different preset settings here. If I select this keyframe, I really want a fast in motion. And what that fast in motion is, if I drag, it's going to look kind of like this. It's going to be straight, which means a constant fast velocity. The more vertical the action of that curve as it comes into that keyframe, the faster that animation is going to be. The more horizontal that curve looks, the slower that animation is going to be. So what we want is kind of an action like this. I think as default it looks something like this, a little bit curved as it gets closer to it. There's a couple of buttons down here that we can change between. There's a convert selected keyframes to linear. If I click that, it makes this incoming curve completely linear. And if I select the keyframe on this side and choose linear again, this button right there, linear, it'll make that incoming curve or outgoing curve, ease out, linear as well. Now the middle one, I don't want it to be linear, I want it to slow down at the top. So I want a more horizontal curve as it goes in and out of this keyframe. There's another option that says convert selected keyframes to auto Bezier, and that'll start to give me a pretty good curve. It's easing in a little bit. If I change the motion now, it's slowing down a little bit up at the top, but I want to change this even more. So it's always good to replay and retest this out. So with that bottom keyframe, I'm going to come over here and choose ease ease. You see it widens it a little more. And ease ease gives me the opportunity to scale one side out. And you see what it's doing? It's not scaling the other side right now. And I can scale this side out and widen it even more. So let's look at the difference now. Fade back and hit play. There you go. So now that's starting to look like a more natural gravity-oriented ball bounce. It's faster as it's leaving the curve, and it's slower as it is at the top of the ball arc. All right. So what I can do is do an ease, ease. I can also do ease, ease in, and then an ease, ease out. And what that does, that gives me the option to adjust one side and not affect the other side. So what I want to do is kind of make the right side wider. Let's make the left side wider as well. And then I can take the keyframe here, and then let's do an ease in, ease, ease in. That gives me a separate command for the incoming curve, the ease in curve. And that gets like this side, and we'll do ease, ease out. And that gives me another option over here. And that's going to really be more of the focus. So it's like an upside down arc if a ball is bouncing horizontally. Now let's play that. There we go. Now we're really starting to get some weight. It's faster in the beginning of the bounce. It's slower at the top of the arc, and gravity looks like it's pulling it down. Now when I'm looking at this now, it really just starts to look like it's a little bit too slow for one bounce. So what I can do is stop my playback. I'm going to get out of my graph editor, which is this button right here. That just toggles on and off the graph editor. And I'm going to go in here and move keyframes closer together. So to do that, what I can do is, I'm not going to adjust the keyframes on frame 0. Now that I've adjusted the individual attributes, you can see the icons now change a little bit due to the way we've adjusted the graph editor. And it's all completely normal. Just kind of note that the icons for the keyframes will change depending on how the graph editor has changed. So let's instead change this to a 1 second bounce. So that means the keyframe on 1 second in needs to be moved to 15 seconds. So all we have to do is make sure we're clicking and dragging on the X and Y now position keyframes, and then moving that over to frame 15. Oops. Make sure we're there. Here we go, frame 15. And if I click and drag on the keyframes that are on 2 seconds in, I'm going to click and drag that to 1 second. There we go. So now the ball will animate faster. It's a 1 second ball bounce. There you go. That's looking a little bit better with timing. It still has the slow ease in and out of the top of the arc, the middle keyframe. And it's always good to go back to the graph editor and just see if we need to make any more adjustments to this. Click off of it. Let's go to Y. And it might have blended it a little bit more, but I might play around with the ease out of the first keyframe and ease in of the third keyframe to be able to see how that's blending it. Good. That looks pretty good so far. So that's really the basics of how to add keyframe animation in After Effects. One more thing before we go is we're going to add squash and stretch to the first ball bounce. And we're using the scale attribute this time. And I do want to note what my original percentage is, which is 82%. That's because I scaled it down to begin with. So we're actually going to keyframe the scale now. We're going to make a couple of adjustments. We really want to have it kind of anticipate, have a ball, and then anticipate down, like squash down, and then stretch up in the air as it's going up. And as it's coming back down, it's going to stretch back down, and then squash as it hits the ground and resets back to the ball form. So naturally speaking, the ball would squash as it hits the surface, and it would stretch as faster as the faster it is moving. And then when gravity is taking a hold of it, and it's the top of a ball bounce arc, as in on frame 15 now, that's the only part where the ball is going to be a perfect sphere, other than when the motion is stopped back at the bottom of the ground. So I want to go to the center of the ball, or center of the ball bounce, which is on frame 15, and hit the stopwatch for my scale attribute. So that'll key my X and Y scale at 82%, make sure it's a full ball or circle. I now want to turn off the constrained proportions icon, which is just to the left of the values for the scale. And this means I can squash and stretch this horizontally or vertically independently. So I'm going to turn off that link button, which is constrained proportions. And then on frame 15, hit the stopwatch button. It creates a keyframe there. Alright, so just before So it's going down. We'll come back and approach the stop point. Just before it reaches contacting with the ground, which is right here, one frame before that, I want to stretch the ball out because forces are applied to it. It's dragging and stretching the surface out. So I'm going to scale it in horizontally, and I'm going to scale it out vertically. There you go. I'm adjusting both because I want to adjust for the mass of the object. If I just scale it in horizontally and forget to scale it out vertically, it's not going to look natural. It's going to lose mass. So scale it in horizontally, scale it out vertically, and that appropriates the mass of the object. Okay, so the next frame, I want to squash it down. It's touching the ground surface. I want to squash it down and scale it out. I don't want to go too crazy. Well, that'll work. So 100 by 60, that's pretty good, about 20% increase each time. And since I have my stopwatch on, it keyed that motion. So if we go back to frame 15, it's still a perfect circle or ball. Now if I drag towards the right, it's going to blend that animation to that stretched out position right before the 1 second mark. And then the next frame, as it hits the ground, it's going to squash down. Now we want to repeat it for the opposite side. So what I have here is a motion that really starts on frame 0, and we're going to come back and kind of adjust this later, but one frame after frame 0, so frame 1, I'm going to stretch it out again. So we'll stretch it out, we will scale it in, and it creates that keyframe. And then back on frame 0, I'm going to squash it down and stretch it out horizontally. So now let's watch what happens. It's going to blend it up and then go back down. So let's watch that in real time. Hit spacebar. So now the ball has some life to it. Feels like it's a more rubbery type object. Has a little bit more character to it as well. Now this is an exaggerated version of a ball bounce, and that's our goal here. But it's still believable. We still feel like this is a ball. Alright, so before we wrap this up, we want to do a couple things. We want it to start as a ball and then end as a ball after it bounces. So we basically want to create a reflex action or secondary action, overlapping action here of the ball resetting back to a full circular shape. So to do that, all I'm going to do is a couple frames later, maybe 5 frames after 1 second, I'm going to reset my scale. It was 82 by 82. Let's go back to frame 15 to make sure. Yeah, 82. So basically after it squashes down for contact, then it's going to reset back to a full ball. So that's good for the ending. It's going to come back and fall down, reset back to a ball, but it starts off squash, so we need to change that. So actually on frame 0, it's going to start off squash down. So what I'm going to do is actually take all of my frames, drag select all of my keyframes, and I'm making sure I'm going to drag select position X, position Y, and scale. So I'm going to drag select on all 3 of those lines. I'm going to left click and move this over 5 frames. That will give me 5 frames to go back to frame 0. Now my animation starts on frame 5. Go back to frame 0, and for the scale, let's type in 82 again. Here we go. So from the starting point, it's going to start as a ball, and then it's going to squash down. That's anticipating the jump. And it's going to jump up in the air, or bounce in the air. The top of the arc is going to be back to a sphere. It's going to fall down and stretch out, and it's going to squash as it hits the ground, and then settle back into a perfect ball. So let's let that play. So now we're getting where it looks a little bit more natural and believable. It's resetting back to a ball. And what we've actually done so far is started to create an animation that follows some of the major principles of animation. We have anticipation. The ball anticipates jumping with the squash down first. It's a fast squash, but it's definitely anticipation. We have follow through, overlapping action. We have timing and motion that we've created, where we adjusted the graph editor, the curve, the way the object moves in and out of these keyframes. Then we've also done squash and stretch, so as it moves around, it deforms in a believable way, but in an exaggerated way. So another principle of animation that we're using is exaggeration. So that's how we can start our compositions, create a basic ball, composition and create our ball bounce composition that has our animation in it. So if we go to our main composition is where we pull in and incorporate all other smaller subset animations and compositions. So what's nice is since I have separate compositions from other areas, all I have to do is click and drag my ball bounce composition into my main composition timeline down here. And if I hit play, well, it'll look the same as the ball bounce composition. But what I can do is now take my ball bounce composition and maybe move it over here some. And let's drag in another copy. Let's drag in another copy of our ball bounce. So there's a second one, and I can hit play. Now I have two versions of the same ball bounce animation in the same scene. I can do it again. I can go back to frame 0 and drag a third composition in here and hit play. Whoop, it's right on top of each other. So let's move this one over here and go back and hit play. Here we go. So this is how we can start to create more complex graphics built off of the hierarchy of our compositions. I have one composition that has all the animation is in that composition, and I've taken my main composition and combined several iterations, copies of that, into one composition. So perhaps I can come in here to, let's see, my second one, and let's see, we'll scale this down a little bit, move it up in the middle, and then we'll take my third one, and we'll scale this down a little bit, even more, and that'll be up there in the corner, and then we'll hit play again. There you go. So now all three balls are bouncing in the same scene. On the middle two are kind of jumping above the page here, so we can just make some adjustments to the height. There you go. And now we have what looks like kind of depth in our scene here. Now, according to the introduction animation I showed earlier, the only things we haven't done is kind of play with ground shadows and whatnot. So one final thing we can do is add some ground shadows back into the ball bounce animation to add a little bit more believability, a little bit more environment here without adding a lot of complexity. So I'm going to, in my ball bounce composition, not my ball bounce composition, I'm going to get my ellipse tool again, and I'm going to click and drag roughly the width of my ball. So something like that. Okay, maybe I'll get my select tool, move it out just a little bit. I'll move it up some. And I'm not going to do a whole lot of animation with this, but I do need this to be gray. So this is going to be kind of a dark gray shape to it. Right, this is going to be used for my shadow. Now, similar to what I did previously, I can right-click on a layer and choose Rename, and we're going to call this one Shadow. We have a ball and shadow. And then I'm going to open up the Ellipse 1 transform for that layer, and we're going to go to Position, right-click on that and choose, right-click on that and choose Edit Value. Units, change that to percentage, and we're going to do 0 and 0. Here we go. So the anchor point is in the middle there. All right. And then now I can move this down underneath, and this is going to be my example of my shadow. So let's kind of scale this down, move this down here. Now it's got a harsh line to it, so we want to also make sure this layer is underneath or behind the ball. And layers in After Effects, all you have to do is click and drag a layer to move it above or below. So if I click the shadow layer and drag it above the ball layer, it is in front of the ball visually. If I take the shadow layer and drag it underneath, it's going to be underneath the ball layer, behind the ball layer. Right? So something like that. So that's okay, but it's pretty harsh shadow, so we can actually blur this layer. If I right click on that layer and choose the shadow layer and choose Effects, Blur and Sharpen, and I'm going to choose Gaussian Blur. When I do that, it's not going to automatically blur anything. I need to open up that layer and open up the effects for that layer, and there's my Gaussian blur effect. I need to add a higher value for blurriness. So blurriness is right there. The higher the value, the more blurry it is. So you can see now that it's very blurry. If I drag that blurriness down some, it's blurry but not too bad. So maybe I'll do like a 30% blur here. There we go. Click off of it. That looks pretty good. It looks like a shadow there. So that was the Gaussian blur. Alright, I can roll up my effects and contents because I'm just going to be using the transform for the shadow layer. And I'm going to be using the scale. So basically I want to turn off the constrained proportions and animate the scale as the ball is bouncing. Okay, so really have a 100 or let's see, 40 frames of animation here. So from frame 0, I want to, with my shadow layer, I want to turn on the time stopwatch for scale, and then I kind of want to watch what the ball does. Okay, so 5 frames later is my next keyframe, so the ball is going to widen. So what I want to do with the scale is drag this out so it kind of matches what would be the shadow for this ball. So over those 5 seconds the shadow widens, and then literally the next frame the ball is going to shrink. Not move it. Let's see if we can get the scale. Okay, let's do it manually here. So maybe 90%. I think my pivot is off. So I think what I need to do, let's see where my pivot is. Yeah, do you see my pivot? It's up there. Pivot's in the middle. So I'm going to move my pivot up, and then I will change my position back down. There we go. That looks pretty good. Alright, there we go. So now it widens, and then literally the next frame we'll scale it in a little bit vertically as well. It's jumping up, shrinking, but also moving further away. So potentially not that much. Maybe we'll kind of scale it out a little bit on that frame. And then let's see, frame 15 is the top part. Maybe quite not. Yeah, frame 20 now is the top part of the shape. So it's now back to a sphere, but we have to think about it's further away. So maybe we'll type in like 100 and 100. Okay. But it's further away, so maybe we'll dial that back down to 90 and 90. Something like that. There we go. So it's going to scale back out to the size. Maybe we'll come back and make some more adjustments later. It's going to come back down. So here's our frame where it's back to being small. I'm actually going to go back to this frame and copy this frame over. So let's go there and drag select on the previous stretched pose for the shadow. Control C and Control V. That pastes that same one there. One frame later is the squash for the ball. So that matches this one right here. So there's our frame there. I'm going to copy that keyframe and paste this over. And now I want it to reset back to the full ball shape. So that would be copying the keyframe on frame 0. So that would be move the timeline to frame 10 frames after 1 second. Drag select over the keyframe on frame 0, Control C, Control V. There we go. Alright, now let's click off and watch that. So if I hit play, now it looks like my shadows kind of staying put, and the ball's moving up above that. So that'll be pretty good. Now if I pause this and go back to the project tab, if you add effects, it adds a different tab to the project tab. So if we go back to project tab in main composition, considering I did a layer structure in my hierarchy, it added that shadow to all of my copies of the ball bounce composition. So that should work on top of the ball bounce that we added to the main composition earlier. Alright, so there's much more we can do with object animation, but this video introduces some of the major topics of animation, the principles of animation, and how to animate using keyframes in After Effects.